Welcome and thank you for sticking around for the second panel. My name is Irina Raicu. I'm the director of the Internet Ethics Program here at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And I don't know about you, but I'm still chewing on all the stuff that we got from the first panel. So I thought that was great, and I'm really looking forward to our panel about the ethics of the Internet of Things. I will introduce our panelists in a second, but just to give a little bit of context, I'm sure you've heard the term Internet of Things. I thought I would read you a list of things that I've been reading about that are by now connected to the Internet. So here goes. Fridges, toothbrushes, cars, hairbrushes, toasters, fitness trackers, light bulbs, baby monitors, pacemaker toys, insulin pumps, photo frames, security cameras, coffee makers, pill bottles, heaters, thermometers, streetlights, printers, umbrellas, and tampons. I could go on, but these are some of the things that are now connected to the Internet and therefore part of the Internet of Things, and that's not even addressing the this is just the consumer Internet of Things that we're talking about primarily today. So we have three outstanding panelists to take us through what all of this stuff means for our lives. In the middle, as it happens, is Athi Vasudevan, who is an executive director within Ernst & Young's National Advisor Cybersecurity practice, where he stewards the development of innovative cybersecurity service offerings in the emerging technology space. Sri leads EY's Cyber Innovation Center in San Jose and has over 15 years of deep technical experience in security architecture, information security risk management, attack and penetration assessments, and identity and access management. I've cropped down these bios a lot, so these are just brief overviews. Brian Jin, next to him, is Director of Legal Services at Cisco and a global privacy subject matter expert within Cisco's legal organization. He has previously held legal roles supporting Cisco's services and marketing organizations, and before joining Cisco in 2005, he worked as an independent consultant for technology startups and as a lawyer at the Walt Disney Internet Group and Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. And next to me is Jeff Klaben, who is the Chief Information Security Officer of SRI International, a nonprofit independent research and innovation center. He is also an adjunct professor in Santa Clara University's Graduate College of Engineering and the co-author of the Computer Incident Response Planning Handbook. Among many other recognition, he received awards for dedicated service and exceptional service in the public interest from the U.S. Department of Justice. So I have a few questions for them, and then we will open it to questions from you. But before we get to those, I wanted to just ask each of them in a few minutes to give us a sense of how they view the development of the Internet of Things and what they see as the promises and challenges that we're facing in this environment. So why don't we start with you, Jeff?
Oh, perfect. I'm feeling irreverent today, so if I go off the rails, please raise your hand if you're feeling going too far. One of the things I do when I drive down here and I lecture on Friday evenings is I listen to the radio program. And I try to find what's immediately relevant to the students in their day-to-day life. And every time there's something that applies to cybersecurity, and which is the course I focus on, and more Internet of Things devices. Internet of Things devices is a very abstract concept, but for me it's become personally relevant in the last month. I got an Apple Watch. I haven't worn a watch in more than a decade, and it's not really a watch, it's a sensor. And it has got my butt into the gym because I'm accountable to a measurement. So it's real, it's meaningful, and these sensors are really important. But obviously the risk is, it's so scary. So listening to news today, there's some really tragic news about gun violence. I don't want to talk about gun violence, but what's interesting to me is that these issues and the fervor that people have and the energy they have over one issue about gun rights, the risk that poses compared to what the risk is of Internet of Things and the privacy and the things that we're giving up, where's the anger? Where's the energy? I don't see any picket signs or protests if people could understand. So the problem are the cognitive limitations. And when I was asked to speak here, I said, hold on, I'm not an Internet of Things security expert. It's like, well, when am I going to become one? I've been dealing with systems, some of the most complex systems for years. It's because there's these different communication protocols and different types of sensors. No one's going to know it all, right? So I guess I'm as much of an expert as anyone because no one's an expert. And so that off-putting, hey, it's too technical or complicated, is the same thing that happens to you in your home when you're setting up Alexa and you're willing to tolerate not understanding what the privacy implications are. So what we have to do is lean in and care and choose to understand. And at the same time, the folks who are leading these organizations and deciding what are privacy and governance issues have to lean in and say, it's not too technical, it's another system, it's just different variables.
Go ahead, Sri.
Yeah, sure. No, that was fantastic, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. And I guess when I look at the future of Internet of Things and what that means to all of us, right? So I basically view that question into two sub-questions. And as you can see, I was trained to be an engineer, so I try to have some amount of logic in the way I think about things. And here we need to think about, do we have a framework to think about the future? So that's where I get reminded of a beautiful quote from Mark Twain, which basically goes like this. It says, history doesn't repeat itself, but often it rhymes. It's such a profound quote, right? So when you think about at the beginning of our personal computing industry, we had amazing innovations with respect to various open source Unix operating systems that essentially destroyed IBM's monopoly in the original, in the first computing days. And then only to be replaced by a different winner-take-all monopoly with Microsoft and their closed ecosystem. So as we think about the future of IoT here, especially in the Silicon Valley, we have these big tech companies, as Apple, Samsung, Amazon, as well as Google, racing towards capturing this market, building proprietary devices with proprietary standards, with no inhibition towards building them to be open source. So that's where it occurred to me that soon our homes will be filled with devices that will run proprietary protocols built on proprietary standards that have not been tested for their security and safety. So we need to start thinking about a future where we are building these devices with open standards. To that end, I think, Irina, you sent out that link about Mozilla's initiatives, which is perfect and timely. So if there's one thing I want the students to take away from today's discussion is to how do you build secure products using these open standards, right? So that's going to dictate the future of where we will be with respect to IoT.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank everyone here for coming today. One of the things that I love about being a privacy lawyer at Cisco is that I actually get to have these conversations around ethics at forums like these, but also in my day job too, right? I mean, I view it kind of, obviously I'm focused on privacy and data protection laws and regulations, but I think central to that is ethics at the end of the day, because they're all so interconnected. And so I love the opportunity to come and join conversations like this one. When I think about the IoT and ethics, I think that one of the biggest challenges that we have today and going forward is that there's so many different players in the IoT ecosystem. You have the device manufacturers and the sensor manufacturers and the infrastructure and hardware providers and the software developers and the solution security providers on top of that, and on all the companies and the cities that are managing all the implementations, and then the individuals at the end of the day that are directly affected by it. And I think that this diversity has its advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, I love it. I would not want one government to be running the IoT. I would not want 3 huge corporations. I work for a huge corporation. I wouldn't want 3 corporations managing the IoT end to end. I want this diversity, and I want small players to play a key role in how we build it out over time. At the same time, though, I think that leads to some of the disadvantages that we'll talk about today of securing it, because it's so fragmented, it's very difficult to have a system where your data is secure. I think over time what we need is what you alluded to, is some kind of IoT infrastructure, a trusted infrastructure that we can all work under. And I think it'll slowly develop over time. In some ways those infrastructures exist, though not directly analogous in other areas. So if I fly in an airplane, for example, or get into an elevator. I just trust that it's safe. I don't need to understand all the process behind it and the machinery. I just trust that a mechanic has checked the cables. I trust the mechanic has checked the landing gear and the air traffic controller is planning flight paths that are safe. But that doesn't exist yet for the IoT. So to me, that's what's so exciting about this time, being in this area and this technology, is that not only do we get to build the hardware and the software and the infrastructure that's the backbone of the IoT, but we also get at the same time to think about these ethical frameworks that will help the future generations.
Great. So I have some questions for each of you, and the one I wanted to ask Jeff is, somebody mentioned the title of this panel. Do you see the title of this panel, if you can't secure, don't connect it, as a provocation, or is it an actual best practice? Are there devices where the connectivity is so important that the benefits of that connectivity outweigh the harms, even in this kind of situation we're in now, where security is imperfect?
So my day job is helping folks make risk-informed decisions. So maybe if I had to tweak the title, it could be know what the risk is before you connect it, or at least put some boundaries up, some sandbox around it. So, but of course, like if you're making conscious decisions about risk, some risk decisions are not worth taking. So I couldn't resist getting an Amazon Echo just to try it out, and I want to be technology conversant. And I said, I'll bring it in the house when I want to play music, and I'll put it in the garage otherwise. And now I don't even plug it in, so I plug it in when I'm going to use it. And so that's my adaptation of the technology. Maybe because I'm more aware, or maybe because I'm just naturally more paranoid. But
The two kind of go hand in hand, though. The more aware, more paranoid. But, yeah.
it's not fair to you guys. The students, the younger folks, there is a lot to worry about. Like, there's just no mental model to take it all in, like, because you're being given these things, and if you want to renew your driver's license, you go online. Like, it's just part of the reality now. But it's even back to the supply chain of, if it's risky, why are you building it? Why are you building it? And everyone taking engineering classes is going to touch IoT devices somehow. And there's the direct ways, and it's not just plugging it in, it's plugging in and integrating it and changing it and maintaining it and thinking about all those steps. And it's not a website, but it's a web service, and it's connecting to something on the back end you don't understand. So the fundamental thing that's missing, or where there's an opportunity to make things more trustworthy, is systems level thinking. So, and that goes to a whiteboard and drawing out. So when I train our engineers at SRI on how to design and secure these systems, I say, think of the data as a well of ink. And what I need you to do is tell me the story about where every drop of ink is going. Actually, where every molecule could possibly migrate. Because when I have that scatter plot or that system diagram, then I can deal with the risk. So the first homework assignment in the class I teach now is write down all the systems and all the accounts and everything that you rely on. And so without that consciousness and the interdependency, we just can't be aware.
So this question is for Sri. We hear a lot about how the Internet of Things benefits or harms individuals. I think most of us think about our own privacy when we bring something into our homes. Could you talk a bit about the ways in which the Internet of Things impacts the common good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I'm going to echo back something that Jeff said around systems thinking and sort of think broadly about sort of the benefits, the positive impact, as well as the negative impact of the internet-connected devices, right? So one example that comes to my mind is at the recent CES conference. I had a chance to investigate a few startup companies, and one startup company that was pretty amazing was these guys were building proprietary, sensors that can be placed in your homes, and it will create a wireless mesh network, essentially, to help with profiling various, physical movements of individuals in your homes. So think of a use case where you want to care for an elderly person, and you want to care for them without invading their privacy, without, installing a camera or a microphone. So you could potentially use this technology to figure out, hey, if my grandpa was in the bathroom for more than 20 minutes, then automatically it means either he must have fallen down or he needs some help. We need to send our caregiver to the home, right? So there are potential benefits of connecting and coming up with these new innovative technologies. The other example, which again has a positive impact for the society, is the city of San Diego, right? City of San Diego has started to roll out a fleet of smart lights, smart street lights in the East Village neighborhood. East Village is one of the crime-ridden sort of areas of San Diego, and what these smart lights do is they have ability to listen in as well as visualize what's happening within a given radius. So what the city is planning on doing is tying these smart lights to the shot spotter network, which is an existing set of sensors that will alert individuals on various gunshots in a given vicinity. It's a fascinating use case to help one curb crime and also protect the civilians in that particular city. But we also have to think about the adversarial examples, right? The examples that have a negative impact with respect to connecting these devices. There are two specific examples that come to my mind. One is a popular toy manufacturer. I'm not going to name who that is. And they came up with a doll with a microphone embedded within the doll. And the way they marketed this particular doll was this doll can have a two-way conversation with your little kid. Okay, so this doll was released in 2015. We did some preliminary studies on the security posture of the doll itself. So what was amazing was more than the system security principles that were used for designing the doll, it was the impact that it had on the population, the user population. In this case, we're talking about little kids. So while we were doing a research, as part of a research project, we looked into several online forums. And one of the comments made me pause and think about the impact of releasing this technology without a lot of analysis. So this was a particular reviewer. I'm going to read out the actual review from their website. So essentially, the reviewer said, my 5-year-old granddaughter absolutely loves her doll. She spends 1 to 2 hours a day with it, but gets very agitated when the battery runs out, right? And the doll says it needs to be charged again. So think about this, right? So we have these massive companies, toy makers, who are pushing these connected products onto parents without thoroughly understanding the impact of technology in early childhood development. To me, I think this is a bigger purpose, and this is a bigger cause of concern. We need to work towards understanding the impact of technology on these young minds. The other example I want to talk about, which is not often talked about, is the notion of algorithmic biases, right? So most of these IoT devices are driven by a set of machine learning models and AI algorithms. So in my day job, I try to advise my clients on AI safety. We do a lot of AI safety research at EY, and one of the things that we think about is algorithmic biases and how that can influence the society, both positively and negatively. So there's been a lot of interesting case studies, and one particular case study that comes to my mind was from the Future of Life Institute. So they did some analysis on popular machine learning, deep learning algorithms through ResNet. So in this particular example, they took one of the stronger algorithms from ResNet. They ran it through this ImageNet, which is, think of it as a massive open database of images. And when an image of an African-American person was passed through this algorithm, it was a classifier. It's a 32 neural net classifier. When it looked at the image of an African-American person, it automatically tagged it to the class basketball. And then you send, and then the next experiment that they repeated was they were inputting a picture of an Asian person, and automatically the classifier tagged it to the class ping pong, right? So one may start to think that these algorithms are racist, but I make an argument that algorithms cannot be racist because algorithms are not sentient to begin with, right? These algorithms are trained on data sets which are curated by humans. So whatever inherent biases that we have when we train these data sets, it's going to be reflected on the algorithms because the algorithms are perfect. And they're going to act on the data sets that's being fed to it. So we need to take a step back and think about, not just pay a lip service to diversity in organizations, but seriously think about how can we set up a diverse team to curate the data sets, set up a diverse team to build these algorithms so that we can build better products in the future.
So your example takes me directly into the question I had for Brian, but before that I have to say that my brain snagged on the phrase, the security posture of the doll. This is not a phrase you would have heard a couple of years ago, right? I mean, this speaks to where we are now. So my question for Brian was, aside from the privacy and security rights of the people who choose to buy IoT devices, like Jeff here, how do such devices impact the rights of those around them? And the doll is exactly one of those things. So let's say if you have visitors to your house and you have an Alexa, or if you have a child who comes to play with your child for whom you bought this doll, do we need to develop new norms and a new etiquette around the use of IoT devices?
Yeah, I mean, so I would start off by just distinguishing between IoT devices that can identify people individually versus those that don't. And most IoT devices, and you kind of touched on consumer versus industrial, most IoT sensors won't require any information about individuals, right? So if there's a sensor in a field that tests the temperature and humidity of the soil, kind of shrug my shoulders, right, from an individual rights perspective. So I set that aside. But for those devices... By the way,
to interrupt you for a second, very important in terms of the common good. Those are the kind of things that can bring us great benefets. Sorry,
absolutely, yeah. For those devices that do actually identify individuals, though, or those that might take video of me or that might track my location or somehow monitor my behavior, I absolutely want to know about that. Those really affect me deeply, and I probably have issues with it. And at a minimum, I would want to know about it, and I would want, ideally, some way to opt out. And I think there should be an ethical obligation or responsibility of the device owners to make that transparency happen somehow, however that may be. In other words, I mean, my view is that individuals really do have rights to know what kind of data is being collected about them and how it's being used, and they should have meaningful choices in that context, and they should be able to get the benefits when they exchange their information. Kind of the larger question is, what happens if these devices somehow become so ubiquitous in our society that it is virtually impossible to avoid being tracked? And we can have a separate debate, maybe a different day, about whether that's actually going to be the case or whether these trusted infrastructures and the like will be able to avoid that world. But if it does happen, and there's a lot of conversation about it, privacy is just one of our worries. I mean, I think we're going to be thinking about how do we protect our free will and our choice and our autonomy, and what value do we place on anonymity. And from a personal perspective, I have done a lot of reflection on that, and it's of huge importance because people are very different when they even think theoretically that they're being monitored.
So I want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, but before we get to that, because we're at a university and we have lots of students, I wanted to ask each of you, as we wrap up this discussion around cybersecurity and the IoT, what are the skills that you think students should acquire as they go into developing or creating or using these kind of devices and dealing with the kind of issues that we've been talking about? And maybe we'll take it this way. We'll start with you, Brian.
Sure. I guess what I would say to students is don't be afraid to be disruptive. On our legal team at Cisco, we actually have, on an annual basis, we give out what we call Barbarian Awards. And they're awards for those lawyers on the team that have just shown themselves to be bold and aggressive and disruptive. And they may have created some significant productivity increase, or they may have just kind of challenged the way that we've done things in the past and kind of broken through barriers. And if you show that you're the kind of person, the student, intern, young worker at a company that actually is disruptive, obviously in a tactful, in a professional, in a productive way, it's not being a jerk, but if you can show that, that to me is a huge and very beneficial attribute. And I guess the other thing that I would say, kind of related in a way, is to understand the data strategy of the companies and the industries that you're interested in. And by that I mean not how the company protects data and how they secure data, which is obviously important, but how the company uses data from a business perspective in order to gain a commercial advantage. Obviously in an ethical way, but to me, the companies that do that really will have a unique ability to outpace their competitors. And if you fundamentally understand the data strategy, I think that in turn helps you be disruptive.
Thank you. Sri, how
Sure.
about you?
Yeah, no, that was great, Brian. So I guess when I think about if I were to be, I'm going to answer this question differently. So if I were to be a grad school student today, what would I be doing, right? So there are two parts to this question. One is, I guess obviously if I'm a grad school student today, I must have racked up a lot of student loan debt right now, and I want to pay that back. So I want to take up a job that's going to pay me well here in the Valley, right? Which would mean I'll be working for one of the internet giants and working towards whatever their mission statement is. That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is, if I'm a grad school student, my life is going to be filled with fun toys, right? Autonomous vehicles, drones, internet-connected devices, medical devices, and a different way to transfer my cognitive abilities to a different person, or maybe upload it to the cloud. So as I think about these futuristic scenarios, I want to take up, I want to aim for those types of jobs that's going to give me some sort of fulfillment, right? Which is more purpose-driven. So that's where I'm going to echo back what Jeff said in the beginning of the session. It's systems thinking, right? Systems thinking is going to be absolutely critical for the future generation of professionals that we will be training. So what does it actually mean? It means you got to take. I would say system thinking is synonymous to perspective taking, right? So you got to take different perspectives. That is an ethical perspective you would have to take as you build these devices. Maybe the questions you need to ask is, who's going to benefit from the system that I'm going to build? Who's going to benefit the most? Who will be harmed, and what would that harm look like? And translate that into specific engineering practices that will help build a trustworthy product that can be released to the marketplace. So that's how I would think about preparing myself for the future.
I've got probably two answers. The formal one is look at my syllabus, because information security management is intended to cover the basics, and but there's obviously more than that. So I think about one of the staff that I hired, very talented guy, and it's like, well, how was I lucky to recruit him? And what he said is, I bothered to ask him for help, and so just making the effort to engage folks. And I guess let me just do that again here today. Just like I felt like I was not an IoT security expert that should be talking about this, and then realized who else is going to do it. This is your issue. No one else is dealing with this. If you're an engineer, if you're a lawyer, if you're a user, it's relevant. This is your call to act. Nobody's going to tell you again, maybe for the rest of your career, but now you've been called out. You have to care about this stuff. And the way that you use devices, I think you should be conscious of that. And the data you've been entrusted with, there's a responsibility to think about. So the systems engineering approach, understanding a development life cycle, and then applying ethical decision-making tools. Have folks seen the movie The Matrix? You remember that? Remember when he reached the enlightened state, right? That strong kung fu? Santa Clara provides the strong kung fu. It is the framework for ethical decision-making. It's wicked strong kung fu when you're going to be dealing with very, very ambiguous questions. The other thing is I was going to point out, the skills around threat modeling are very, very valuable. So if you can think about any sensor or any electronic device that's capable of capturing, using, storing data, or communicating, any communication channels that can communicate over, that can be used, just like, now you won't remember MacGyver. This was a show about folks hacking.
None of us do.
I learned that I'm old because I use these references, students don't know. But anything can be reused in a way that it can be used for attack or hacking in a way it wasn't designed. And so adopting the hacker ethos of, for good or for bad, how could this device be used in different ways is a very, very valuable skill set. And then using a mindset where you're willing to challenge and ask tough questions. So for me, it's delightful when a student comes back and says, you know, after this lecture, I went back to work and I'm working on this software design project, and I realized this doesn't look right, and, you know, raised an issue or something like that. The last thing I'll point out, just because I realize the Internet of Things tagline still ruffles me, is I think just like cloud computing is intellectually lazy, it's because it's an abstraction that means somebody else is dealing with it. It used to be, you know, having a third-party data center where I still had to care. Cloud, oh, it's a happy cloud, somebody else's problem. It's getting hacked, but it's not my cloud. Internet of Things is a very intellectually insulting phrase because, one, it says internet. Internet means it should be internetworked, right? So all these, so it's implying that your blood pressure monitor should be connected, right, by design. And things is way too abstract. And so we can't do things across Internet of Things, you know, generally. We have to actually get into the domain of automobiles and infotainment systems and have specialty areas, because we can't just solve these problems with one magic wand.
You can see that Jeff is one of those disruptive barbarians because he's challenging the whole name here. I will say that ethics is a kind of systems thinking, and that I think if you bring the ethical perspective into your work, that actually is a kind of a way of being the disruptive barbarian at this stage. I think that's what's coming through from our conversation. So questions, please. Yes, so, and then.
Are you concerned that any government regulations to make the IoT more secure could inhibit the ability of smaller companies to compete with companies like Google or Microsoft?
Sure, yeah. So the way I would think about it is think about IoT within the perspective of various industry verticals, right? So there are extremely stringent regulations for medical devices, for network-connected medical devices. FDA has issued two strong guidance documents, and very soon these guidance documents are going to become standards in the next 18 months or so. So as you think about the regulations that's coming down, most of these regulations are around basic security hygiene. As such, lack of regulations results in essentially a wild west, right? So one of the examples I could think about is the recent botnet attacks, right? So there were so many network-connected, IoT within air quotes devices that had default passwords or no passwords at all to their admin interface. So you had script kiddies, low level, from a technical proficiency standpoint, low level hackers essentially using these, millions of these devices to essentially do something very simple, such as run ICMP ping sweeps on specific websites. So without a common framework to think about the security of these devices, the entry level for abusing these devices and using it for malicious purposes is very low. So we need to start thinking about what regulations make sense within the purview of the industry sector that we live in. Some of the industry sectors are extremely regulated, like the healthcare sector. Some of them are not. But also think about, apply the ethical decision-making framework to say, is this the bare minimum we should be doing as we design these products, or should we be doing something else?
Yeah, I think that regulators have a really tough job, meaning they're playing catch-up because the companies are moving at a pace that's so fast, and the regulators are dealing with the changes that they think are going to happen, and but they're always one step behind. And so in many ways, they have to deal in principles, right? Kind of broad principles. There's a lot of attention nowadays in the privacy world, at least, given to this European data protection regulation that people are talking about as this big sea change. But what they don't kind of see in the big picture is that the predecessor to that has been around since 1995, and it's been really old. And so that was just kind of a refresh, and it took that long to catch up and change that framework. And now companies are reacting to that. But
the idea that this can create a level playing field, it may mean that smaller firms have to invest more upfront to engineer devices well. I love that. My concern is inconsistent application, or that we've got offshore competition that has a whole different set of rules that they're following. I see opportunities for soft governance in combination with your awareness being another path forward. Underwriter's Laboratory, when you buy a electric blanket or socket or something, those things are UL approved. Actually, Underwriters Laboratories become relevant again, and they're actually getting involved in IoT device governance. So as a consumer, the more that you can be aware and demand these things, the less the government might make some half-hearted efforts to try to regulate it and still not be totally effective.
So I'll note that the title of the talk was about security, but there was some discussion of privacy also. And Brian mentioned the example of trusting the mechanic on his airplane because, that we should be able to develop a similar trust framework. But in that situation, I think the mechanic's motivations and my motivations are pretty well aligned. We both he wants me to be safe, I want to be safe. But very often when we're dealing with personal data, we're working with providers that have cross motivations with ours, where they would like to monetize our data, they would like to use it for advertising or aggregation or that sort of thing, and that's not what we want. So I guess the question there is, how do we deal with that sort of a situation?
It's a great question. I mean, I do certainly agree there are tensions all over the place in this context, and that in some ways goes back to regulation. We can't rely completely on governments to regulate because they're a step behind, and it needs the shared responsibility of the companies together with the users in order to come up with the solutions.
The saying is, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Right? So what I would argue is, you think that you have one set of interests in mind, but just like we might use Facebook or something, we're choosing to have our behavior and data usage monetized in ways we understand or maybe don't understand. But that's the game we're choosing to play. So I think there is some alignment there. It's really nice not to have the perception of having to pay for stuff, or maybe it comes at the back end with an erosion of privacy that folks don't really understand. But I'd say our behavior is a conscious choice to give up the limited privacy we have left.
And companies and consumers will vote with their dollars and their feet, meaning I think if there are companies that abuse data, that will deter people from using that service in a way. Not all the time, but in many cases.
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, the way I see it is a lot of these organizations do not actively invest in safety engineering practices. So when you think about a medical device manufacturer, they usually have an excellent safety engineering arm, and then slowly they're playing catch up with their security risk management functions. So, but when you think about internet startup company, a classic example was the fitness app Strava. How many of you read the news about what happened with Strava, right? So that's a great example of how the data that was published as part of the heat map, they did not pause to think that it will reveal the secret military base locations across the world, right? So that's applying a little bit of thinking about the safety impact due to security risk, right? They're thinking about our safety impact due to privacy risk and engineering controls in place into the products. And also, just from a business workflow perspective, do we really have to publish the heat map, right? And I can bet you no one in that company actually thought about that particular abuse scenario. So this goes back to Jeff's initial comment about if he had one or two engineers who was trained in building out that particular aspects of threat model for that particular app, maybe we wouldn't be talking about this scenario at this point in time.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Leslie Sakurka. I'm a professor at Menlo College down the road and a member of the Markkula Partnership. There's a lot of millennials, budding leaders, managers, product developers, you name it, in the room. And I'm hearing a lot of the way forward is to think about systems thinking, as ethical decision making, slowing things down a little bit so we can think of alternative perspectives. I'm wondering, how would you suggest we arm people coming up to take the helm of these corporations or starting their own to honor and value slowing things down a little bit when we're racing to market, trying to make profits, in competition, and trying to make a name or hold the firm together and survive if you're getting started. I'm very interested in how to support young people's learning so that they can guide the direction of the product development in a way that very much mirrors what you're advocating. How would you move us forward to teach in that regard?
What do you do, Jeff?
I think there's a combination of things here. So there's some basics that I think folks involved in engineering, product management, leadership need to learn. I like Apple's model of pursuing lots of projects and then cutting them quickly, right? So if you can make a risk-informed decision that this, Suzy Q doll that can do really scary things is not worth pursuing, don't get so far in the project that you have no choice but to release it to the market. So there's business and dollars and cents that come into that, and that's just understanding good marketing practice. There's other soft skills that I'm always trying to improve. Somebody told me, I worked with a lot of different technically capable people, and he said, Jeff, you and I can do all the same things. And I would say he's probably more technically capable than I am. And he said, but for some reason you can scare people better than I can. And what it is the technique of creating emotion so that people take action. And so that's part of a leadership role in security. And so I think giving people training and techniques in how to deliver a message in an articulate way and bringing issues to a leadership team or product management function to help them make informed decisions. There's technique around that. Folks fall into the trap of everything sensational, and we get hooked on the next big Mirai botnet, and who cares about the next individual thing? Let's think. We're educated people. We can think about things in patterns over time, and so being able to think beyond the one individual crisis and Chicken Little, it's basically how is taking all this risk and building these products going to affect our long-term, company organization vision. I know that's really lofty, but each of these things can be taught in sections and modules, and and modeled for folks to follow.
And I would add that good and responsible data practices, that's an asset to a company that's tangible, and poor practices similarly are a liability. And if you look to valuations, for example, of acquisitions of startups, you'll immediately see that as part of the due diligence practice, you get a large data security and data privacy questionnaire, and if you don't have appropriate answers to those, that will ding you. And we're certainly on our side seeing that more and more, and it is affecting valuations, and it'll eventually affect whether a company is going to get bought or not. So a lot of the young entrepreneurs are thinking about exit, and that's a big consideration, I think.
So one of the things I would think about to answer that particular question is start with the purpose of the company that you want to build, right? Everything starts with the purpose. So if you're in the business of selling smart connected dolls and making profit, right, then you need to reevaluate like how you align your choices to that particular purpose. And these days, it's very easy to start a company, right? You have, in fact, last Amazon Web Services reInvent conference, they released an out-of-the-box deep learning API that you can, subscribe to for pennies to the dollar. So, you can set up, AI, machine learning is the hottest, trend in technology. So every startup company wants to build something using AI and machine learning models. But perhaps you can even stop to think about biases in these in and out-of-the-box models, right? So you can create a platform where you can do all kinds of testing using different sort of input parameters to see if there are biases in the models and correct for those biases. So within security, there's a concept of forensic analysis, right? When things go wrong, the previous panel talked about data breaches, And part of the breach exercise is to have a, a dedicated, well-rounded forensics function to figure out what happened, and in a systematic way. So I would even think about, for smaller companies, maybe think about a function where you can, you can conduct fairness forensics for your AI algorithms, right? Isn't that a crazy idea? I don't think so. So how do you set up a fairness forensics function? It's essentially you run through, you automate, millions and millions of tests, unit tests and system tests with different input parameters to see if the algorithms are behaving in a different way, and course correct for that.
My apologies. I'm looking at the clock and we are out of time, so I feel like
One more, we want one more.
we have time. Great. Well, there are at least 2 more questions. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Never mind. I take it all back. Keep asking. Yes.
A lot of the commentary has been on new developments and startups, but we're in a world right now where a lot of the industries that are legacy, that have never been on a network, are now being shifted to them. So at this point in time, we have a world littered with industries that are not prepared to take on the responsibilities of connecting their devices to the systems, and no one to educate them and no one to hold them accountable. So how do we start to bring these people into the fold? Because we can't stop using an HVAC system in a building now that it's on a network. We still need the HVAC system, but somebody put it on a network. We can't stop using our video conferencing system, but none of these things are secured, and none of the agencies have any interest in securing them because they still need to sell the product, and they can't pull it off the market nor reveal the fact that they are a vulnerability on the network. So how do we start to move that conversation forward for these industries that are still struggling to catch up?
Good, Trey. Okay.
I can put you in touch with a Cisco sales team. Wonders,
Is that part of the effort? Is it, are companies now trying to talk to the kind of companies that are being described and to try to pull them into a more secure operational pattern?
I think so. I mean, I think the companies that you talk about, I think they realize in many ways that they're missing opportunities in the marketplace by not being secure, right? You don't think so? I see a head shake.
I would argue very much not. They're scared of it. They are legitimately scared to put themselves on a network and make themselves vulnerable.
Oh, meaning they're not going in the network at all. Well, that's the missed opportunity, right? That's the point I'm taking, which is you're an old school company. There are all these other opportunities if you do connect, right? If you become secure, if you become part of that world. No, I'm going to stay in this company, this world. That's like newspapers keeping their heads down, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a trade-off between convenience and security, right? I mean, the real question is, why do you have to, take a network that was, or take a bunch of devices that were offline and make them online? What's the real value? What's the purpose? What's the big question you want to answer? If the big question is convenience, like ease of management, or if you want to, open up the connectivity to a broader audience, then the next set of questions you need to ask is like, let's perform a threat model. Let's understand, can we have an automatic solution from Cisco or someone else wherein we can auto VLAN tag all these, legacy devices and put them in separate virtual networks? That way, they're not accessible from the internet. So let's think about what are the foundational requirements one would have to satisfy before getting access to those legacy devices that you talked about that are connected on the internet, right? So it really comes down to the question, when I say start with why, I think I really mean it, right? So you can actually apply that logic to each and every, each and every question or each and every decision that you're faced with when you think about building these products.
I do see a lot of energy going into trying to find better solutions. SRI has a Internet of Things security and privacy lab, for example. They work on whole city level designs, automotive applications. So, I see smart companies engaging and trying to get help. But to your point, how do we paint ourselves into this corner, right? Where there's pressure to make connections, why not plug it in? And now, in my role, how do I govern these things? If I'm supposed to be the guy that makes sure things meet the requirements and are safe and secure, well, the last step is change control. Right before somebody plugs something in, I might say, okay, it has to go through a review process. But you know what? It's too late because the design is done, right? So then I can have a political war with someone and say, you're not plugging this in, and then they'll replace me and somebody else will plug it in. But but you can walk back the design process to, there's a project manager, even if it's an existing system. You know, most organizations, if they're putting more than 20 or 100 hours of effort into an initiative, it's a project. And someone's acting as a project manager. Now you have to give the project manager the resources, which is the time and potentially the dollars to do a security assessment or a review. So if I'm buying a product that has these types of issues, I have to ask those questions. And you guys have seen these questionnaires. I'm at the other end of that, and hopefully you've been asked those questions enough times that you have an intelligent response. But if not, there's informed consumers who, at least on the business side, who are challenging these things. So Silver Spring Networks is a good example. They're the biggest provider of smart meters, right? And so they know when you go to sleep and when you get up and when you're home and when you're not, and that data is flowing all around. Now they seem to have, you know, quite good security practices, but there's still a public debate on who actually owns that data, who has a right to access it. So at least at the beginning of a project that's new or that involves some new architectural change that means plugging things in, that you're giving folks a chance and you're funding the analysis. HVAC system, now I've got instrumentation at SRI that is decades old, and if it's running on an old operating system, I can't patch it. So I have other techniques. I can do network isolation, air gapping. There's a lot of other measures I could apply, but I need the time to design and implement. Did that answer the question?
Reinforced the already existing ideas.
Fair enough. Thanks.
So now that I know we have more time, I have a follow-up question to something. You had mentioned the smart streetlights in San Diego, and we talked about, you know, there's all this talk of smart cities. Some people see that as a dystopian future, not as a beneficial one, and worry, for example, that those things will be put in certain neighborhoods and so directed at certain populations and not others. So, and also worried that these decisions are being made without a lot of real public input, where a lot of the stakeholders are left out. So how do we get those conversations to happen more, where people from, you know, those neighborhoods in San Diego, are they talking to the people at City Hall who are putting in those streetlights, or to the technologists who are developing them? And how do we get students who are going to be working with very good intentions on such devices to consider this kind of broad public input that we should have before we implement them?
Yeah, so again, I can offer a counterexample to San Diego with Seattle. The city of Seattle, they wanted to launch a similar sort of initiative. I think it was late last year when they purchased a bunch of wireless sensors, and they wanted to create a mesh network in the city to sort of help with certain basic traffic triangulation activities. And that particular proposal was actually shot down, and it came on the news, I think it was about a couple of weeks back. And so part of the reason why it was shot down was the manufacturer was essentially snipping off the MAC addresses of any wireless device that had its wireless adapter turned on. And they did not disclose that as part of their initial sort of procurement process, right? So the ACLU, along with City Hall and a bunch of privacy practitioners, they got together, did some investigative digging into the technology components that were being used for that particular implementation, and they found there were certain fundamental design choices that were not made in the true spirit of what was intended to be deployed. So they took it, you know, they went back and they had heated debates around this topic. And then finally, that project has been scrapped at this point in time, right? So the question we need to really ask is, when we think about these smart cities and the implementations, and I think Mayor of San Jose is also thinking about the future of connected cities in San Jose. I think as citizens, we got to participate in those dialogues right from the get-go, right from the initial tender stage to we should have a say in vetting out the various vendors who will be involved in setting up the smart city fabric, and also have pointed questions, maybe even in the interest of full transparency, have them publish their security requirements and see how well those requirements are being met by these vendors, right? In major corporations, we help a lot of companies at EY, and there's, whenever we engage in any third parties, there's this third-party risk assessment questionnaire, right? There's a lot of, I guess, oversimplification of that over several years. And with these days, in certain verticals, such as the healthcare vertical, these questionnaires offer a lot of insight into the security best practices of these third-party companies. So likewise, I think we need to have a standardized way to collect information from the government agencies that's deploying these projects, and also provide feedback, and that should be an iterative process.
Brian or Jeff, did you have any thoughts?
I think the point that you highlight is very valid. I think there are lots of people with respect to some of this technology that feel kind of helpless, that it's just happening to them. And it comes back to your point of citizen involvement. And I also think it relates to the idea of transparency, right? So as cities and groups make these kinds of decisions, it's important that they open the doors and tell people why they made the decisions, how they did, and exactly what data they're collecting, and how they're going to use it, right? So it's kind of the basic principles behind transparency that are critical in the process.
I'll leave it there.
Okay. Yes, Peter.
In the tobacco industry, we saw secondhand smoke become an issue, and then regulations came out around that, right? Smoking regulations in cities and things like that. Getting back to the point you raised earlier, I think it was Brian that raised it about, rights people should have, if you are, enter an environment where you're around a device that's listening to you or whatever, that you should be notified or have a right to opt out. How do you see that playing out in this IoT world? Do you see it going the same way that things went in the tobacco industry, protecting people from secondhand smoke, protecting them from secondhand IoT, or what do you see?
I like that idea. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer to it. I know that, in the IoT world, you can't have an interface on a sensor that's the size of a grain of salt that measures, temperature and things like that. So there has to be some kind of interface where you first engage, but I don't know where that engagement is. And I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. I mean, I think it's, in this particular industry, here's where people will get notified, and in this industry, it's slightly different. But I don't have any magic answers to that one. I mean, I think that's one of the most critical questions, though, is how do you provide that transparency?
I'm not sure the analogy lines up, because IoT is not an industry, right? So there's a sector, so self-driving cars, I think there's a great opportunity, and it's critical to put governance around that. So there's a lot of work, because you're not going to have universal answers for all these things. The grain of sand comment actually made me remember, because I get to see some of this cool new stuff at SRI. We have a project for DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, called DARPA Shield. And so literally, it's just a little smaller than a grain of sand. It's an embedded component on a chip that helps you validate authenticate that the chip is not counterfeit. So there's hardware-level solutions to some of this. Now, part of it is making people aware of what the solutions are and getting them adopted in the industry. So I think there's an opportunity to learn and share more of that with each other.
I do think, though, that we are giving off digital exhaust all the time with our phones, meaning there's signals being sent out everywhere, and they can track your location even if you don't associate to it. And the question is, how do you deal with that kind of information, and what controls should IoT infrastructure players play in that?
Yeah, so I guess, as I think about the future, what can I expect, right? So, one thing, so today we have sort of labels for food safety, right? When we buy produce from like Whole Foods or any supermarket, like we know exactly what we are producing, what we are consuming. So likewise, it won't be, it is realistic to expect IoT vendors to produce some sort of a cybersecurity safety label that comes with the device. So something that says, hey, this device can, listen to you. This device can take pictures of you. That way, you as a citizen, you are informed on the choices that you want to make. And I'm sure there is a startup idea that's waiting somewhere where you can install an app on your phone, walk into your friend's house, and the app will do auto discovery and it will collect all the devices that's listening to you, and you can even use your app to control those devices and make them mute or deaf, whatever you want to do, right? So if someone has some ideas around that, please let me know. I'm happy to resign from EY and contribute in that development as well.
And this is not a coming problem. This is a current problem. I don't know if you read the articles, but around Christmas, a lot of people bought and gave away Amazon Echoes, and suddenly there were discussions among roommates, for example, about whether they wanted one in the living room or not, or spouses. So all of these things, when I was talking earlier about how we need new norms, I think before we even get to labels or anything, we're going to have a lot of conversations around what we're okay with and our rights in our homes and in our cities and wherever else we live our lives. So thank you very much. I think this really is when we run out of time, and we're going to move to the reception outside. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.